My name is Nora Bennett. I'm 44, and I manage quality investigations for an auto parts manufacturer outside Indianapolis. Most days, my job is to figure out where a handoff failed before one wrong measurement turns into 10,000 wrong parts. I'm used to separating what someone remembers from what was actually written down. I'm used to asking who told whom when, and in what words. None of that helped me at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning when my older brother called and said our father was in the hospital. Dad's stable, Evan told me. They think it was a mild heart attack, and before you ask, he does not want you here. He said the last part slowly, as if he were saving me from hearing it from Dad himself. I believed him. For the next 30 hours, I obeyed a request my father had never made. Then I walked into North River Medical Center anyway, and a nurse outside Dad's room looked at my visitor sticker and said, "You're Nora? He tried calling you over and over yesterday. Why didn't you answer?" I had 3 missed calls from Dad on my phone. I also had 3 years of messages that suddenly looked different. At first, I thought the story was about one ugly lie my brother told during a medical emergency. It wasn't. The harder part was realizing my father and I had both spent years thinking the other one had chosen distance, and we had both been using the same person to prove it. My father, Henry Bennett, was 73 then and had been retired from teaching high school shop for 9 years. He lived in the same small brick ranch in Fort Wayne where Evan and I grew up. The garage still had the workbench he built when I was 12, the pencil marks from our heights on the pantry door, and a coffee can full of screws that had been sorted badly since the first Bush administration. Dad believed throwing away a bent nail was a character flaw. Evan was 48 and lived 12 minutes away. He supervised field crews for a heating and cooling company, which meant his truck was always full of filters, wire, receipts, and one clean dress shirt hanging behind the driver's seat for customer meetings. He had a wife, Denise, and a son in community college. He was the person Dad called when the furnace made a noise, when a prescription needed picking up, when the snow was too heavy, or when the TV suddenly forgot how to be a TV. I lived a little over 2 hours south. That distance had become one of the facts our family used as evidence for whatever argument it wanted to make. If I came up twice in 1 month, Dad would say I was running myself ragged. If I missed a weekend, Evan would say, "This is what I mean. You don't see the daily stuff." He wasn't wrong about the daily stuff. Our mother, Marlene, died 5 years before Dad's hospital stay. She had pulmonary fibrosis, and the last 14 months of her life reorganized all of us. Evan handled most of what happened in the house because he was nearby. He took her to appointments, learned the oxygen concentrator, brought groceries, and once spent 6 hours in an emergency department on a Wednesday night before going to work at 7 the next morning. I came up most weekends and used every bit of leave I could. I dealt with insurance calls, medication lists, forms, and the family calendar because those were things I could do from Indianapolis after work. I told myself we had divided the labor by geography and skill. That was true. It was also true that when Mom got scared at 2 in the morning, she called Evan because he could be there in 12 minutes and I could not. After the funeral, people kept telling me how beautiful my eulogy was. They told Dad how lucky he was to have a daughter who kept everything organized. I remember Evan carrying folding chairs to the church storage room while one of Mom's cousins hugged me and said, "Your mother always knew you were the dependable one." I saw Evan's face when she said it. I noticed. Then I let the moment pass. That omission sat in our family longer than any of us understood. For the first year after Mom died, Dad and I still talked every Sunday night. Sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for 4. He wasn't a man who enjoyed discussing grief, so we talked about furnace filters, my commute, the price of lumber, and which neighbor had parked too close to his mailbox. Evan was at Dad's house 3 or 4 times a week, and I was grateful for it. Then Dad fell off a 6-foot step ladder while cleaning leaves from the gutter. He broke his left wrist and needed 8 stitches over one eyebrow. Evan called me from urgent care. By the time I got to Fort Wayne that evening, Dad was home, furious about the cast, and more furious that Evan had told me. I walked through the kitchen and saw the steep ladder leaned against the garage wall. "You're done with that," I said. Dad looked up from his recliner. "Done with what?" "Climbing ladders when nobody's here." I'll pay someone to do the gutters. Evan knows people. Pick somebody. There are conversations you can hear going wrong while you're still speaking. This was one of them, Dad said. I fell once, Nora. I didn't become incompetent. I didn't say you were incompetent. You drove 2 hours to tell me how to use my own house. I drove 2 hours because you hit your head. And now you're here, so everything needs a policy. Evan was standing by the fireplace. I expected him to tell Dad I had a point. Instead, he said, Nora, maybe give him a day. I heard criticism where there was probably some common sense. I'm not trying to take over. Dad gave a short laugh. Could have fooled me. I left 40 minutes later, which I'm still not proud of. I didn't slam a door or make a speech. I set a container of soup in his refrigerator, put my coat on, and said I'd call Sunday. I spent most of the drive home rehearsing the better things I could have said. On Sunday, Dad was cool but polite. The next week, Evan called and told me, he thinks you see him as a project now. Just back off a little. So I did. A month later, I asked Evan whether Dad wanted me up for his birthday. He's doing lunch with me and Denise. Evan said, he told me not to make a production out of it. I mailed a card and called at 7 that night. Dad answered, but the conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. I assumed Evan had been right. Dad assumed something else. I would not learn what until the hospital. By the 3rd year, Evan had become the unofficial switchboard for our family. It wasn't formal. No one announced it. If I needed to know whether Dad had scheduled his eye appointment, I asked Evan. If Dad wanted to know whether I was coming for Thanksgiving, he asked Evan because Evan had usually texted me first. When I was delayed at work, I sent Evan the update because he was already at Dad's house. It felt efficient. That is the dangerous thing about a bad system. Sometimes it works just well enough that you stop noticing what it costs. The Tuesday Dad went to the hospital started before dawn. Even said Dad had woken around 4 with pressure in his chest, tried to wait it out, then called him. Evan drove him to North River. The emergency department admitted him after blood work and an electrocardiogram. Evan said the doctors were keeping him for observation and would probably do more testing. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with one sock on when I asked, "What room?" There was a pause. Then Evan said, "Nora, he told me not to have you come." I stopped pulling on the second sock. Those were his words? Close enough, he said, and the answer bothered me immediately. What does close enough mean? It means he's tired. He doesn't want stress. He said you, and he always end up arguing about what he should be doing. The latter came back to me immediately. So did the short birthday call, the missed Thanksgiving, the careful Sunday conversations that had gradually become every other Sunday, then once a month. I said, "Put him on. He's sleeping. When he wakes up, I want to talk to him myself." Nora, don't make me referee this today. That sentence got me. Referee? It made me sound like the person bringing conflict into a hospital room where my father had just had a heart attack. I told Evan to keep me updated. Then I went to work at 10:18. My phone rang while I was in a supplier review. I had it face down on silent. When I checked 20 minutes later, I saw Dad's name in my recent calls. I stared at it. Then I texted Evan. Dad called me, is he okay? Evan answered 5 minutes later. He's groggy from meds and keeps hitting people in favorites. Nurse took the phone for now, don't call back. He finally settled. I typed. Did he ask for me? 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared again. He asked why you weren't here, then said never mind. Please leave it alone today. At 1:42, Dad called again. I was on the production floor in hearing protection and missed it. At 40:57, he called a 3rd time while I was in my car leaving the plant. I saw the screen light up this time. Dad? My thumb moved toward the green button. Then Evan's morning sentence came back to me. He does not want you here. The call stopped before I answered. I sat in the parking lot and hated myself for being relieved. I texted Evan again. 3 calls now. I'm worried, he replied almost immediately. I know he's been restless. They gave him something earlier, and he's fixating. I'm here, he is safe. He said again he doesn't want to visit. I read that message until the screen dimmed. Then I drove home with Dad's number sitting 3 times in my call log, like a question I had decided not to ask. That night, I slept badly and woke before my alarm. At 7:06, I texted Evan for an update. He called instead. "They're doing a cath this morning," he said. "Probably around 10. Did he sleep?" "Some." He kept waking up. Evan said, "Can I talk to him when he wakes up? Myself? He's anxious. Don't start this again." "I'm asking to talk to my father, and I'm telling you what he wants." I looked at the 3 missed calls. "What if you're wrong?" He exhaled hard enough for me to hear it through the phone. "About what?" "About what he wants." "Nora, seriously? I have been here since 4 yesterday morning. I slept in a chair, you're 2 hours away, and somehow I'm still getting audited." That landed because it contained a truth. Evan had been there. I had not. "I'm not auditing you. You always are." He hung up before I could answer. At 8:15, he sent one more message. "They're taking him down soon. Please don't come storming in." He was clear. I read it at my kitchen counter with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Then I opened Dad's call history again. 3 calls. In my work, when a report says the machine did one thing and the data says it did another, you don't vote on which version feels kinder. You stop the line until you understand the difference. At 8:27, I called my boss and said I had a family emergency. By 8:40, I was northbound on Interstate 69. I did not tell Evan I was coming. I spent the drive making arguments for him. Maybe Dad really had said no visitors, then changed his mind under stress. Maybe the calls were accidental. Maybe Evan was exhausted and paraphrasing badly. Maybe I was driving 2 hours to prove that I could still turn somebody else's crisis into a problem to solve. Every version was possible. That was why I kept driving. I reached North River a little before noon. The cardiac floor was quieter than I expected. All beige walls, rolling carts, low voices and televisions turned down too far to understand. I found Dad's room number on the text Evan had sent the day before when I asked where his bag was being kept. That detail mattered because I had no right to demand information from anyone just because I was his daughter. Dad's door was partly closed. A nurse in navy scrubs came out carrying an empty water pitcher and glanced at my visitor sticker. "Can I help you?" "I'm Nora Bennett. Henry Bennett is my father. I'm not asking you to tell me anything private. I just wanted to see if he's awake." Her face changed. "You're Nora?" I nodded. "Oh," she shifted the pitcher to her other hand. "He's been asking about you." The hallway seemed to narrow. "About me? He tried calling you several times yesterday. I helped him with his phone twice because his hand was shaking. He couldn't understand why you never answered." For a second, I heard nothing but the soft squeak of a cartwheel somewhere behind me. I said, "Was he confused?" The nurse was careful. I could see the moment she decided how much she could appropriately say. "I can't discuss his medical condition without his permission. But when I helped him use the phone, he knew who he was calling." "What time was that?" She glanced toward the room. One was early afternoon, the other was before shift change, maybe 5. 1:42, 4:57. My phone suddenly felt heavy in my purse. "Thank you," I said. She gave me a small, uncertain nod. "He's back from his procedure and sleeping. If he's okay with visitors when he wakes up, I can let him know you're here." I sat in a chair at the end of the hall and opened my messages with Evan. "Dad called me. Is he okay?" "He's groggy from meds and keeps hitting people in favorites." At 1:42, a nurse had helped Dad call me on purpose. At 4:57, she had helped him do it again. I did not feel triumphant. I felt sick. About 20 minutes later, Evan came around the corner carrying 2 coffees. He stopped so abruptly that one lid popped loose and coffee splashed over his fingers. "What are you doing here?" I stood and faced him before I answered, suddenly certain I needed the exact words. "Dad called me 3 times yesterday." His mouth tightened. "I told you why." The nurse helped him make 2 of those calls. He wiped his hand on a napkin. Okay. He wanted to call you. He also said he didn't want a scene. That is not the same thing as not wanting me here." Nora, not here. I agree. I moved away from Dad's door and toward a small family waiting area. Evan followed because neither of us wanted to be the siblings arguing in a cardiac hallway. I kept my voice low. Did Dad tell you, in words, I don't want Nora at the hospital? Evan looked past me toward the vending machines. He said he didn't want stress. That is not what I asked. He said you two don't know how to be in the same room without turning everything into a debate. Did he say he didn't want me here? Evan's jaw moved. Not exactly. There it was, but it did not feel like an answer yet. What did he say exactly? He said he didn't want you driving all the way up if you were just going to worry and tell him what he should have done. And you turned that into he does not want you here. I was trying to keep him calm. You also told me his calls were accidental. I said he was groggy, not that the calls were accidental. You said he kept hitting people in favorites. He was on medication, and I didn't know what he'd do next. A nurse helped him dial me. Evan pressed his palms against his thighs. Fine. I should have worded it differently. I almost let that sentence pull us into the old fight, the one where every disagreement became about tone and every outcome became nobody's responsibility. Instead, I asked one more question. What did you tell Dad when I didn't answer? He looked at me then. Nothing. The answer came too fast, and he knew I heard it. What did you tell him? He asked if you were working. And? I said probably because that was usually true during the day. That's all? Nora, he just had a heart attack. So tell me the truth once, and then I will go sit quietly until he wakes up. His face changed, not much. A little color rose along his neck. I told him you knew he was here. I waited without filling the silence or rescuing him from it. And I said you were respecting his space. My stomach dropped for a different reason. Did you tell him I wasn't coming? Evan looked away again. I said you had work and that you didn't think coming up would help. I had never said either thing. For years I had been angry at Dad for making me feel as if every visit were an intrusion. Suddenly, I could see the same shape from the other side. Dad had been lying in a hospital bed calling me, while Evan told him I had decided not to come. I had been in Indianapolis staring at those calls, while Evan told me Dad had decided not to see me. The lie was not just between Evan and me. He had built 2 different rooms and put Dad in one and me in the other. The nurse came into the waiting area a few minutes later and said Dad was awake enough to know I was there. She had asked him whether he wanted to see me. He said yes. She said. Evan closed his eyes for half a second. I followed the nurse. Dad looked smaller in a hospital bed than he ever had in his recliner at home. There was tape over the inside of his wrist from the procedure, a monitor clipped to his finger, and a plastic cup of ice on the tray. I stopped at the doorway because I still needed him to choose me himself. Hey, Dad. His eyes opened wider, and he pushed himself slightly higher on the pillow. Nora? Yeah. He looked past me toward the hall as if someone else might be coming. You came? It was not accusation. It was surprise. I did. His mouth pulled to one side. Evan said you couldn't. I sat down carefully. He told me you didn't want me here. Dad stared at me as if I had switched languages halfway through the sentence. What? He said you were very clear. I said I didn't want you driving up at 5 in the morning for nothing. His voice was rough. That's not the same thing. I know. He looked toward the window, then back at me. I called you. I know that now. You didn't answer. I was in meetings for the first 2. I saw the 3rd. Evan told me you were groggy, that the calls weren't really intentional, and that I shouldn't call back. Dad's eyes moved toward the open door. He said that? Yes. He was quiet for so long that I heard the monitor change rhythm when he took a deeper breath. Then he said, he told me you were giving me space. I never said that. Dad closed his eyes. I reached for the rail but stopped before touching his hand. We don't have to do this right now. He opened his eyes again. No, maybe we do. The nurse came in then to check something on the monitor. Dad asked her if I could stay, she said. As long as he felt up to it, but he needed rest. So we talked in pieces. The doctors had found a significant blockage and treated it during the catheterization. Dad said he was expected to stay another night if everything looked good. I did not ask the nurse to explain his condition to me. Dad told me what he understood, and later he asked her questions while I was in the room. After 10 minutes, he said, "Evan told me at Christmas you didn't want to come because I'd made things awkward the year before." I looked at him. "What Christmas? Last one?" "I asked Evan if you wanted me there Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. He said you were going to Denise's family on Christmas Eve and wanted a quiet day Christmas." Dad frowned. "We went to Denise's at 4. I was home all day Christmas." "I was home too." He rubbed his thumb over the blanket. "He said you picked up some year-end project." "I didn't. I had no year-end project that week." Neither of us spoke for a moment. That was when the hospital stopped being the biggest thing in the room. Until then, I could still tell myself Evan had panicked during a medical emergency and handled it badly. Christmas meant this had not started Tuesday. I pulled out my phone. I still have the messages. Dad looked tired, but he nodded. I found the thread from December. Deck, 18/7/14 p.m. me. What does Dad want to do for Christmas? I can come either day. If Christmas Eve, I can be there by noon. Evan, Eve is Denise's family. Dad says don't worry about Christmas Day. He wants a quiet one. Me? Are you sure? I can come Christmas Day. Evan, I'm sure, don't push. He gets uncomfortable saying no to you. I turned the screen so Dad could read it. He read slowly, twice. I never told him that, he said. Then he reached for his own phone on the tray. Look at what he sent me. His hands were unsteady, so he gave me the phone and told me the passcode. I did not search anything he did not ask me to search. He told me to open his messages with Evan and go back to December. There it was. Dexum 19. 8:03 a.m. Evan Nora's slammed at work through New Year's. She said it's probably better if she skips Christmas so nobody gets tense. Dad had replied with one word, okay. I looked at that word for a long time. Then I looked at my father. He was staring at the ceiling. You thought I chose not to come? He nodded. I thought you chose not to have me. He nodded again. Neither of us said Evan's name. We did not need to. Dad fell asleep after that, and I sat beside him for another 20 minutes listening to the soft mechanical sounds around the bed. I had come to the hospital prepared to defend myself against one sentence. Your father does not want you here. Instead, I had found a sentence Dad had never said and a Christmas neither of us had wanted to spend alone. When I stepped into the hall, Evan was gone. He had texted me. Went home to shower. Back later. Please don't interrogate Dad while he's recovering. I did not answer. I went down to the cafeteria, bought a bowl of soup I barely touched, and opened my messages. My first impulse was to search 3 years for every time Evan had lied. That was the quality manager part of my brain looking for a clean failure point. Families are not production lines. There was no clean point. There were, however, patterns 2 Thanksgivings earlier. I had written Evan that I was required at the plant on Thursday because we were commissioning a new line, but I could come to Fort Wayne Saturday morning and stay overnight. He had answered. Dad already made plans with the Morrisons Saturday. Maybe skip this year. Dad had never mentioned the Morrisons to me. When he woke later that afternoon, I asked him. He blinked. The Morrisons were in Arizona that year. What did Evan tell you about me? Dad thought for a moment that you volunteered for the holiday because the overtime was good. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. I was salaried. I had not been paid $1 extra. Another example came from Dad, not my phone. The previous spring, he had had cataract surgery. I knew about it because Evan told me after the date was set. I had texted, I can take that Friday off and drive him. Tell me what time. Evan had replied, I've got it. Dad would rather keep it simple. Dad told me that day in the hospital, he said you couldn't get away from work and felt bad about it. The details were small enough to survive because nobody had ever compared them. Not every distance between Dad and me belonged to Evan. That mattered too. I found a message from Dad himself, from 18 months earlier. You coming up this weekend? I had answered 4 hours later. Can't. Exhausted. Maybe next month. No explanation. No warmth. I remembered that weekend. I had worked 62 hours because of a recall investigation and wanted one Saturday when no one needed anything from me. Dad had not done anything wrong. I had been tired, resentful, and still carrying the latter argument like a permit to be distant. Dad admitted his part just as plainly. I could have called you about Christmas. Yes. I could have asked you instead of asking Evan. Yes. His eyebrows lifted, as if he was checking whether I really meant it. You could have called me. Yes. For the first time in years, the word did not feel like surrender. Dad turned his head toward me. I thought you were waiting for me to apologize. I was. For the latter? For telling me I acted like you were a project? And for a few things after? I thought you were waiting for me to admit you were right. That too, he gave a tired snort. There she is. Normally that would have irritated me. In the hospital it almost made me smile. Then he said, I was mad at you, Nora, but I never stopped wanting you here. That sentence hurt worse than I expected because it did not erase anything. It made the lost time more specific. A little after 4, Evan came back in clean jeans and a gray sweatshirt. He brought Dad's glasses, phone charger, and the paperback Dad had been halfway through at home. Those were the actions of someone who knew exactly what our father needed. Dad watched him set everything on the tray. Sit down, Dad said. Evan looked at me, then at Dad. You should rest. Sit. Evan sat in the second chair. Dad did not make a speech. That was not his way. He held up his phone. Why did you tell me Nora couldn't come for Christmas? Evan's eyes closed briefly. Dad? Evan said with warning already in his voice. Why? You two were barely speaking. That still isn't an answer to what Dad asked you. Evan looked at me. You showed him messages. He showed me his. Dad said, answer me. Evan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Because every time you two got together, I spent the next week hearing about it from both sides. I didn't call you after Christmas, I said. Not that Christmas, before, after the latter, after Father's Day, after the stupid argument about the car. Dad frowned. What car? The one you were going to drive to Louisville with the bad tire. I replaced the tire. After I made the appointment, I could hear the resentment beneath the facts. Evan looked at me again. You know what it was like? You would call with a solution. Dad would get mad because he hadn't asked. Then Dad would call me because he was mad. Then you would call me because he was mad. I was the human complaint department. That sounds exhausting, I said. He seemed thrown by the answer, as if agreement had interrupted the argument he expected. It was. It still doesn't explain Christmas. He looked down at his hands and rubbed one thumb across the other. I thought a little space would help. You didn't create space. Dad said, you lied. Evan's face hardened. I managed a situation neither of you would manage yourselves. There it was, not cruelty, permission. Somewhere along the way, Evan had decided that being in the middle gave him the right to control the doors on both sides. I asked, when did that start? He rubbed his forehead. I don't know. Try, I said. I'm not asking for an exact date. His mouth tightened. After Mom. The room went still. Evan stood, walked to the window, then came back. When Mom was sick, everything came through me because I was here. Everybody was fine with that when it was useful. Nora, you called me from Indianapolis and asked what the pulmonologist said. Dad asked me if you were coming. Aunt Cheryl asked me what Mom needed. I knew the oxygen settings, the pharmacy hours, which chair she could sleep in, how long she could make it from the bedroom to the kitchen before she had to stop. I know? No, you know the list. You don't know what it was like. I almost defended myself. I had driven every weekend. I had spent hours on insurance appeals. I had used vacation time. All of that was true, and none of it changed the nights he had been there. So I said, you're right, I don't know what the nights were like. His eyes flashed, and at the funeral, everyone thanked you. Dad shifted in bed. Evan kept going, but his voice got quieter. They thanked Nora for organizing everything. They told her she was strong. I carried Mom to the bathroom 2 weeks before she died, and nobody even knew because why would they? Then she dies and suddenly I'm the guy who fixes Dad's furnace. Evan, Dad said. No, you did it too. You'd tell people. Nora took care of all the paperwork. I don't know what I'd have done without her. You know what you said about me? Evan's close by. Like geography was my contribution. Dad's face changed. I had never heard Evan say any of this. It did not make the hospital lie smaller, it made him less simple. Evan sat back down. After the latter thing, Dad called me 3 times about you. You called me twice about him. I thought, fine. I'll keep them apart until they cool down. Then it was easier. For whom? I asked. He gave me a look that said the answer should have been obvious. For everybody at first, Dad said, and later, Evan did not answer. I knew enough from work to leave silence alone when someone is deciding whether to tell the truth. Finally, he said. Later, I liked that Dad called me first. There was no villain smile. He looked ashamed before the words were finished. He continued. I liked being the one who knew. I liked not having you come up and turn one problem into 6 phone calls and a spreadsheet. I liked that he needed me. Dad stared at him. Evan shook his head, and I was angry. Every time Nora did show up, you'd brighten up. Then she'd leave, and I'd be the one taking you to physical therapy or bringing over salt for the water softener. You'd tell me how smart she was, how good her job was going. I know that sounds pathetic. It sounds human, I said. It also doesn't make it okay. I know. Do you? I asked, because his apology still sounded narrow. His eyes met mine. I know about yesterday. I leaned forward. What did Dad say yesterday before you called me? Evan swallowed. He said, don't drag Nora up here before we know what this is. She'll scare herself. That sounded exactly like Dad. And you told me he didn't want me here. Yes. What did you tell him after I missed the calls? That you knew he was here, that you were busy, that you thought space was better. Dad closed his eyes. I asked the part I did not want answered. Were the calls accidental? No, the nurse's question had already told me that, but hearing Evan say it still mattered. Did you know he was trying to call me? Yes. Why tell me he was confused? Evan pressed his thumb into his palm until the knuckle went pale. Because if you called back, you'd come? Nobody spoke for several seconds after that answer landed in the room. Finally, Dad said, get out for a while. Evan looked at him. Dad, Evan said with warning already in his voice. I didn't say forever, I said for a while. Evan stood. He put Dad's glasses on the tray with a care that looked almost painful. At the door, he turned to me. You think this means you get to take over now? No, I said. It means neither of us gets to take over. He left. Dad stared at the closed door. He did a lot for me. I know I saw how much he did for you. I leaned on him. I know you leaned on him because he was nearby. I put him in the middle. Yes. Dad looked at me. You could soften one of those. I could, but I don't think either of us needs softened versions anymore. That time, he did smile. It lasted about 2 seconds, but it was the first thing in the room that felt like us. Dad stayed one more night. I booked a room at a motel 6 minutes from the hospital, instead of sleeping in his room or moving into his house without asking. That sounds like a small choice, but it mattered. My old instinct was to prove love by becoming useful before anyone requested it. The next morning, Dad asked me to bring him his reading glasses even though they were 6 inches from his hand. You're testing me, I said. Maybe. I handed them over. He put them on and said, see? You can help without reorganizing the building. Remarkable medical breakthrough. He laughed, then pressed a hand to his chest because laughing was uncomfortable. We both got quiet after that. Before discharge, Dad listened to the instructions, asked his own questions, and wrote notes in the little pocket notebook he always carried. He wanted Evan there too. I did not object. Evan arrived 10 minutes early and stood by the window while the nurse went over the basics with Dad. I said almost nothing unless Dad asked me something. Evan did the same. For once, nobody translated Henry Bennett to Henry Bennett. When the nurse left, Dad closed the notebook. "I'm going home with Evan," he said. Evan looked surprised. So did I. Dad pointed at me. "You can follow us. You both can help me get settled. Then everybody goes home." "Works for me," I said. Evan nodded. Dad looked between us. "And from now on, if I want Nora to know something, I tell Nora. If I want Evan to know something, I tell Evan." Evan stared at the floor. Dad continued. "If either one of you says the other one said something important, I check." I said fair. Evan nodded again. Slower this time, and Dad kept watching him. Dad looked at him. "Say it." "Fair." There was no hug. At Dad's house, everything looked offensively normal. His newspaper was still folded on the kitchen table from Tuesday. A coffee mug sat beside the sink. The steep platter that had started our long argument was hanging sideways on hooks Evan had installed in the garage after the fall. I saw it and laughed under my breath. Evan followed my eyes. "What? You did put the ladder away?" He kept using it. Dad called from the living room. "I can hear you." For about an hour, we did practical things. Evan checked the thermostat and moved a case of bottled water where Dad could reach it easily. I picked up prescriptions with Dad's written list and his card. When I got back, I did not sort his medicine cabinet. I set the bag on the counter and asked where he wanted it. He noticed. "So you can learn?" "Don't get used to it." Evan almost smiled. Then Denise called him. He stepped outside to answer. Dad sat at the kitchen table, turning his pocket notebook over in his hands. "You know," he said, "your brother isn't the only one I owe something." I sat across from him. "I made it easy for him to do this," Dad said. "Not the lying, that's his. But I used him instead of calling you because I was mad and because I didn't want to hear you tell me I was being stubborn." "You were being stubborn. See?" I looked at the table. I made it easy too. Every time Evan said you wanted space, some part of me was relieved I didn't have to risk hearing it from you. Dad nodded. We wasted a lot of time. There was no useful answer to that. 3 Christmases did not come back because we had finally compared text messages. His 71st birthday did not reappear. Neither did the Sundays I spent grocery shopping at home while assuming my father preferred the quiet. "I know," I said. Dad ran his thumb along the notebook's edge. "Your mom would be furious with all 3 of us. She'd start with you." "Probably, and she'd save me for dessert," he smiled. Then I said something I had rehearsed on the drive north years before and never managed to say. "I'm sorry I left after the ladder fight. I was scared because you hit your head, and I turned scared into instructions." Dad looked at me. "I'm sorry I made you feel like a visitor who had to earn the right to worry." That was enough. Not because it fixed the last 3 years, but because it was direct. Evan came back inside. He picked up his keys, then stopped. I should go. I stood too. "Can we talk outside for a minute?" His expression tightened, but he followed me to the driveway. The March air was cold enough that neither of us wanted a long performance. I said, "I'm not asking Dad to cut you off." "I know. I'm not taking over his appointments." "Okay. And I'm not using you as a source for what Dad thinks anymore." He looked toward the house. "Probably smart. I need something else before we pretend this is finished." His shoulders rose. "What?" "If we're going to have any relationship after this, you cannot make yesterday a wording problem. You didn't word something badly. You lied to me, and you lied to Dad." He looked down the street. "I already said I was wrong. You said you were wrong about yesterday." He was quiet. I waited without filling the silence for him. Finally, he said, "I lied about Christmas too. Yes? And Thanksgiving?" I had already suspected it. Hearing it still hurt. "Why the Morrisons?" He gave a tired laugh. "They were the first people I thought of. You knew they were in Arizona." "Dad knew? I forgot." That was almost absurd enough to be funny. It was also proof of how little scrutiny he expected. What else? Evan shook his head. Not every missed dinner was me, Nora. I know. You really did cancel sometimes. I know. He looked at me then, almost angry that I would not let him turn complexity into innocence. Dad really did complain about you. I'm sure he did, especially when I pushed too hard. And you complained about him. I did. I'm not saying you invented our problems, I said. I'm saying you used them. His face softened in a way that looked more defeated than agreeable. Yeah, the word was quiet. I told him I was not ready to pretend we were fine. I also told him that if Dad called him for help, that was between them. I would not compete for the job of favorite child, primary child, reliable child, or any other title we had spent too much of our adult lives measuring. Evan put his hands in his jacket pockets. You know what I thought when I saw you at the hospital? What? That you were going to walk in and everybody would listen to you. Like always. Nobody listened to me. I listened to a nurse. He nodded once. Then he said, I'm sorry I told you he didn't want you. That was the first apology that named the thing. I accepted the words. I did not tell him everything was forgiven. For the next 6 weeks, Dad and I spoke every Sunday at 7, directly. The first few calls were almost comically careful. He would say, I'm telling you this myself, before mentioning something as ordinary as a cardiology appointment. I would say, do you want help, advice, or just an audience? Before offering a solution. Sometimes he said, just an audience. I learned to be one. Dad started cardiac rehab and complained about it with impressive consistency. Evan drove him twice when his car was in the shop. I knew because Dad told me, not because Evan sent an update. That distinction was small enough that nobody outside our family would notice it, and large enough that I noticed every time. There was no dramatic punishment for Evan. He did not lose his job, his house, or his family. Dad was angry with him for a while, then gradually let him back into the ordinary routines they had shared for years. I thought that was Dad's decision to make. My decision was different. I stopped using Evan as the bridge to our father. I also stopped being his private place to unload every frustration with Dad. When he texted, Dad is refusing to schedule the follow-up. Can you talk sense into him? I answered, tell Dad you're worried. I'll ask him about it Sunday if he wants to discuss it. The first time I did that, Evan sent back a thumbs up. No argument. 2 months after the hospital, he asked if I would meet him for coffee halfway between Dad's house and his. We sat in a booth at a diner where the coffee came in thick white mugs. Evan looked older than he had before Mom got sick. Maybe I did too. He told me he had started talking to a counselor through his employee assistance program. He did not present that as a transformation. He said Denise had told him he had been angry for years and had gotten so used to being necessary that he heard anyone else's involvement as criticism. I still think you disappeared sometimes, he said. I did. I still think Dad gives you credit for things I do. He does. I hate that more than I know how to explain. I understand. He slowly rubbed both hands around the coffee mug. And I still lied. Yes. He nodded. That was the conversation. No perfect reconciliation. No promise that holidays would be beautiful from then on. By summer, Dad and I had our own routine again. Once a month, I drove up on Saturday. Sometimes we had lunch. Sometimes I sat in the garage while he sanded a piece of oak and told me I was holding the flashlight wrong, even when there was no flashlight involved. One afternoon, I noticed 3 old Christmas cards tucked into the side of his roll-top desk. Mine, he had kept them. For years, I had imagined him opening my cards with polite distance while preferring the child who actually showed up. Dad had imagined me mailing them because mailing was easier than coming. Both versions had been incomplete. I picked up the oldest card, the one from the Christmas Evan had told me to skip. Dad said I was mad when that came. At me, mostly, he said, with no attempt to soften it. Why keep it? He shrugged. Because you're my daughter. That answer did more for me than a long apology could have. We cannot recover the dinners we missed or the ordinary Sundays we handed to pride. Dad's heart did not become younger because we finally started talking. Evan and I did not return to some perfect childhood closeness that never really existed. What changed was simpler. If Dad wants me, he calls me. If I want to know what Dad means, I ask Dad. And if Evan tells me how someone else feels, I no longer build a life around the message. The last time Dad called while I was at work, I was in another supplier meeting. My phone was on silent, and I missed it. I looked at his name in my recent calls when the meeting ended. For half a second, I was back in that hospital parking lot, staring at the call I had let stop because I believed someone else knew what my father wanted. Then I called him back. He answered on the second ring. "Nothing's wrong," he said immediately. "I need to know if you still have your mother's cornbread recipe." I leaned back in my chair. "Yes." "Good. Send it to me before I forget where I put my copy." "I will. I'll send it before I leave work." "And Nora?" "Yeah? I'm glad you called back." This time, there was nobody in the middle.